She turned her back for just 5 minutes and lost her daughters. 8 months later, a pilot spotted the two girls on a private island for millionaires. Don't forget to subscribe and write in the comments what country you're from. The sun rose slowly over the rooftops of New Orleans, bathing the narrow streets in a soft amber light. The air was already warm and thick with humidity, hinting at the coming heat of the day. In a small, two-bedroom apartment above a corner store, Samara tightened the laces on her nursing shoes and glanced at the digital clock on the kitchen wall. It was 6:43 a.m., and her night shift at St. Jude's Hospital had ended only 40 minutes ago. Her back ached from hours on her feet, but the ache she felt in her heart had nothing to do with exhaustion. She turned away from the clock and toward the low table where her twin daughters sat cross-legged on the floor, giggling over a box of crayons and a tattered coloring book. Amara, the elder by 3 minutes, had her thick hair tied in two neat braids, her concentration fierce as she carefully colored in the petals of a flower. Anisa, more whimsical and messy, had already drawn a dragon over half the page and was now coloring the sky purple. Both wore oversized t-shirts that had once belonged to Samara, their knees dusted with crumbs from the toast she had made before collapsing on the couch a few hours earlier. "Mama, look," Anisa chirped, holding up her drawing. "It's a magic sky." Samara smiled and walked over to kiss the top of her daughter's head. "It's beautiful, baby. Just like you." For all the chaos that marked their lives, missed rent, 2 jobs, food stamps, and the neighbors who occasionally pounded on the ceiling because of the girls' laughter, there was an anchor in their tiny home. Samara was that anchor. At 32, she had long since given up on sleep and comfort, but she had never let go of the promise she'd made the moment they placed those squirming, crying babies in her arms. "I will keep you safe. Always." That morning, as she changed out of her scrubs and into a clean shirt, Samara received a message that made her pause. It was from the White Beacon Foundation, a group she had heard about a few times at the hospital from other single mothers. They provided basic support: diapers, food vouchers, sometimes even childcare. The message invited her to a family fun day at a local park with a pop-up clinic, job counselings, and entertainment for kids. It was signed with a smiling emoji and a promise of free resources and opportunities. At first, she ignored it. These events always seemed like more stress than help. But then Amara accidentally knocked over her glass of milk, and Anisa shouted about sticky feet, and Samara looked down at the worn-out shoes she had been wearing for 4 years. The thought of a few hours in the sun with her girls, maybe even talking to someone about better job options, sounded, if not magical, then at least like a breath of fresh air. They arrived at the park around noon. Music drifted from loudspeakers, and colorful balloons were tied to the backs of every chair. Volunteers in matching white polos guided families to booths where they handed out flyers and little bags of snacks. Samara held her daughter's hands tightly as they wandered past rows of tents offering health screenings, job boards, and cheerful volunteers praising the foundation's work. The girls were thrilled. There were clowns, a bouncy castle, and a petting zoo. For the first time in weeks, Samara saw them laugh without restraint. Their faces lit up like tiny suns. A volunteer in her 20s with long blonde braids knelt beside them and offered them both pink wristbands with glittery stars. "We're offering a special weekend camp for selected kids," the girl explained, smiling up at Samara. "It's all paid for by the foundation. Nature walks, crafts, singing, swimming lessons. Just a couple of days, but they come back with so many stories." Samara hesitated. "How far is it?" "Oh, not far at all," the girl said. "Just outside Baton Rouge. We have medical staff, licensed counselors, and cameras everywhere. You're welcome to visit any time, though most parents take the chance to relax or catch up on work. We'll bring them back Sunday evening." The thought of 48 hours without having to juggle daycare and work just to rest her aching body and maybe find a few shifts at the clinic. She didn't want to admit how tempting it was. The girls, upon hearing the words swimming and camp, jumped up and down and begged her to say yes. "I don't know," Samara murmured, but the volunteers were persistent, their voices gentle, almost rehearsed. She was shown a clipboard with consent forms, contact details, insurance waivers. They offered to help fill it out. She remembered signing quickly, distracted by the noise, the kids pulling at her shirt. They said the bus would leave in an hour. Samara kissed her daughters goodbye at the edge of the park. They waved at her from the back of the white bus, their faces pressed to the window, smiles wide and oblivious. "Love you, Mama," Amara shouted. Anissa mimicked her, forming a heart with her fingers. Samara waved until the bus turned the corner. By that evening, something felt wrong. The contact number she had been given led to a voicemail box that was full. The emails she sent bounced back. She called the number again and again. No answer. The flyer had no physical address. She went back to the park, but the tents were gone. The grass had already begun to rise again where the booths had stood. It was like the event had never happened. The next morning, panic set in. She went to the police, carrying the signed form and the wristbands the girls had worn. The officer at the desk looked at her wearily. "You signed the children over, ma'am." "No, I didn't," Samara snapped. "I signed a permission slip for a weekend camp." "That's not how it looks here." He held up a printed document. It bore her signature, her name spelled correctly, her handwriting perfectly mimicked. But she had never written those words. It stated she was surrendering her children voluntarily into care. Samara's hands shook as she stared at the paper. "That's a forgery," she whispered. The officer leaned back. "You'll need to file a formal complaint, but without more evidence, I can't open a case, especially if the kids aren't technically missing." She left the station in a daze, walking home in the midday heat as if she had no bones inside her body. That night, she sat on the floor of the girls' room, surrounded by their drawings and toys. The silence screamed in her ears. She whispered their names over and over again like a prayer. Amara, Anissa, Amara, Anissa. Weeks passed. Samara stopped going to work. She printed hundreds of flyers with their photos. She called hospitals, shelters, churches. No one had seen them. She visited the addresses she'd scraped together from screenshots and social media tags related to the foundation. Some were empty buildings. Some had never existed. One morning, 3 months after the festival, she found an envelope wedged beneath her apartment door. It was plain, unmarked, sealed with tape. Inside was a torn map with a GPS coordinate scrawled in pencil and a single typed sentence. "They are not here. Look east." There was no signature, no explanation. The coordinates pointed to the coast of France. Samara stared at the map for a long time. Then she stood, walked to the closet, and pulled out an old suitcase. She sold everything she could: her mother's ring, her TV, even the car she could barely keep gassed. It wasn't enough, but she didn't care. She borrowed the rest. The night before she left, she sat in the girls' room again. She didn't cry. There were no tears left, only resolve. She whispered into the dark, "I'm coming, babies. I don't care where they took you. I will find you." And as dawn broke over New Orleans for the last time in her old life, Samara boarded a plane bound for Paris, the coordinates burning in her pocket like a second heartbeat. The train from Paris to La Rochelle rattled over worn tracks, the countryside unfurling in blurred strokes of green and gray beyond the smudged window. Samara sat stiffly in her seat, her suitcase tucked between her legs, her shoulders drawn tight with tension. She hadn't slept in nearly 36 hours, not since the long-haul flight from New Orleans and the layover that had stranded her overnight in Charles de Gaulle. Her eyes burned, her hands trembled from fatigue and too much vending machine coffee, but her mind refused to quiet. The GPS coordinate from the map clutched in her pocket had led her here, to the western coast of France. It was the only lead she had, and she had followed it like a lifeline. La Rochelle was a quaint port city brimming with history and charm, narrow cobblestone streets, ivy-covered buildings, and fishing boats bobbing in the harbor. To anyone else, it might have seemed idyllic, but to Samara, it was an alien landscape. She spoke only broken French, and every face she passed on the street was that of a stranger. She found a cheap room in a run-down boarding house above a closed pastry shop. The room smelled of mildew and old books, and the walls were thin enough to hear the coughs of the man next door. But it was safe, for now, and cheap enough to stretch the last of her euros. She spent her first day walking the length of the harbor, trying not to cry as she scanned every crowd, every boat, every face for something familiar. Her daughter's laughter echoed in her memory, cruel and phantom. She clutched the laminated flyers she had brought with her, color photos of Amara and Anissa, taken just days before they vanished. She had printed them in French as well, with the help of a free translation app, Disparus. Deux petites filles, avez-vous vu ces enfants? She handed them out to anyone who would take one. Most people smiled politely and moved on. Some didn't even glance. Over the next few weeks, Samara settled into a harsh rhythm. She worked part-time washing dishes at a tourist cafe on the edge of the port, her hands raw and waterlogged, just to afford the room and a few meals. Every spare moment was spent hunting. She visited local libraries, searched records of private islands along the Atlantic coast, asked endless questions about yachts, charters, clubs, and exclusive properties. Again and again, she heard the same phrase, delivered with a shrug or a downturned glance. Je ne sais pas, désolé. The wall of silence pressed closer with each day. No one wanted to talk. Those who did seemed nervous, as if even acknowledging the idea of missing children might summon trouble. One harbor worker told her gently, "There are places people don't talk about, places owned by people with more money than God. If your girls went there, I'm sorry." Her hope began to fray. Her hands grew numb from passing out flyers. Sometimes she walked the beach until midnight, staring out at the black water, whispering her daughters' names to the wind. She refused to give up, but the solitude of her mission gnawed at her bones. One afternoon, she returned from yet another fruitless trip to the marina, her feet blistered and her spirit low, when she found someone waiting for her on the steps outside her boarding house. An old man in a heavy coat and salt-streaked boots, sitting with a cane across his knees and a cap pulled low over his gray eyebrows. He was staring at one of her flyers, holding it in both hands like it was made of glass. "You're looking for these girls," he said in English, his accent thick but clear. Samara's breath caught in her throat. She stepped closer, gripping the railing. "Yes. Have you seen them?" He didn't answer immediately. He studied the photo again, then nodded once, slowly. "A few months ago, I was out on my boat. There was a yacht passing by, large, private, not a fishing vessel. 2 little girls on the deck. They were..." He hesitated, squinting. Brown skin. One had braids, the other shorter curls. Samara's knees nearly buckled. She sat down beside him without waiting. Where? Which direction? He gestured to the west, toward the sea. There's an island. It's not on tourist maps. Private land. Belongs to a club or a family. Rich Parisians. Sometimes they come down for the summer. I stay away from there. Everyone does. Do you know the name? They call it Saint-Marin-d'Olaire, but you won't find signs. No dock for the public. Only certain yachts are allowed near it. Samara pulled out her notebook, her hands shaking. Can you show me on a map? Please. Anything. The old man, his name was Gerard, led her to the harbor office, where he pointed out the island on a nautical chart. Samara traced it with her finger. It wasn't large, just a dot off the coast, but the distance was enough to isolate it from prying eyes. She went to the local police with the information the same day. She presented the flyer, the GPS map, and Gerard's account. The desk sergeant listened without taking notes. He shook his head before she even finished. That island is private property, he said. We cannot just go there because someone thinks they saw a child. There are families with homes, guests with children. You have no proof. I have my daughters on that island, she snapped, and a witness. You have a picture and a guess, he said, his tone hardening. If you interfere with the property of that family, you will be the one in legal trouble. Samara stood there, stunned. The cold weight of power and privilege settled over her shoulders like lead. She left the station trembling with rage. That night, Gerard visited her again. This time, bringing a thermos of coffee and a roll of stale bread. He sat with her in the boarding house kitchen as she cried silently into her hands. Not everyone here can be trusted, he said quietly. The people who own that island, they pay very well to stay invisible, even some police. And what can I do? Gerard sighed. You'll need someone louder than money. Someone with a bigger mouth than they have lawyers. The next morning, Samara took a train to Nantes, following a hunch that media might listen where police had not. She visited 3 newsrooms, begging for someone to hear her story. No one did. One receptionist handed her a business card and said a reporter named Louis Garnier had once done stories on child exploitation before he was fired. Too many powerful enemies, she said. Samara found him in a narrow apartment above a bookstore, his office covered in stacks of files and old clippings. Louis was in his late 30s, with tired eyes and a permanent scowl. When she showed him the flyers, he didn't scoff or roll his eyes. Instead, he reached for his recorder. They say you're crazy, he told her, but that just makes you sound like everyone else I've helped. Tell me everything. For the first time in months, Samara felt her voice steady. She told him about the festival, the forged documents, the envelope with the coordinates, the sightings, the refusal of the police. Louis listened, scribbled notes, and when she showed him the map, he narrowed his eyes. I've heard of that island. Not directly, but whispers. A playground for the elite. Off limits to press. Rumors of children being flown in for parties, adoption showcases, private galleries. No proof. Just too many stories like yours. She looked at him, heart thudding. Can you help me get there? I can get you close, he said, but we'll need more than just talk. We need eyes on that island. Pictures, names, proof. Samara didn't hesitate. Tell me what to do. He leaned forward. First, we watch. Then, we strike. Back in La Rochelle, Louis rented a battered van and converted it into a makeshift surveillance post. They parked it near a cliff overlooking the marina, and began documenting the comings and goings of yachts headed toward Saint-Marin-d'Olaire. With the help of borrowed drone equipment and a telephoto lens, they started building a case. Samara learned how to pilot the drone, her fingers clumsy at first, then steadier with each flight. 3 days later, she brought the drone back to the van, her face pale. She handed Louis the controller wordlessly. On the screen was footage of a sleek white yacht gliding through the waves. On the upper deck, 2 small girls stood beside a man in sunglasses. One wore twin braids, the other a yellow sundress. Louis stared at the footage, then turned to her slowly. "Is it them?" Samara couldn't speak. She could only nod, her eyes wide with something like fire. She had found her daughters. Now she just had to bring them home. The footage looped endlessly on the small screen in the back of the van. Again and again, the sleek white yacht drifted across the frame like a serpent through dark water, and the 2 tiny figures on its deck appeared, almost too small to see. But Samara didn't need clarity. She didn't need facial recognition software or confirmation from any authority. She knew. She knew those shoulders, that stance, the slight tilt of the head Amara always did when the wind caught her braids. She knew the way Anissa curled her fingers inward when she was cold, even though the sun had been high that day. There was no room for doubt. Her daughters were alive, and they were on that island. Louis watched her carefully as she stared at the footage. He didn't ask the obvious questions. He didn't challenge her certainty. He simply picked up his notebook and said, "Now we build the case." For the next week, they monitored everything. Louis pulled favors from old journalist contacts, obtained a list of registered yachts that frequented the private marina across from Saint-Marin-d'Olaire. He noted the recurring names, the captains, the silent crew lists, the voids in the logs where children were never officially mentioned. Samara barely ate or slept. She lived in the van with Louis, rising before dawn to send out the drone, watching the island's shoreline, the movement of boats, the helicopters that buzzed low over the tree canopy and then vanished. They noticed patterns. Supply vessels came every Thursday. A white van met them at a dock that was hidden by a curtain of trees, and out came crates marked with corporate logos, fine wines, fresh fruit, medical shipments from private clinics. Sometimes there were guests dressed in pale linens stepping daintily onto the pier like royalty. Always white, always rich. Samara saw children too, but never the same ones twice. They didn't laugh. They didn't run. They walked where they were told, stood when ordered, posed when commanded. And always near them was someone, an assistant, a bodyguard, a handler. One evening, as the sun dipped below the sea and cast gold over the water, Samara saw a girl in a white dress on the balcony of one of the villas, her bare feet dangling over the edge. She sat perfectly still, staring at the horizon. Louis took a picture with his telephoto lens, and even in the grainy image, Samara could see the longing in her profile. That girl couldn't have been more than 6. "They rotate them," Louis said grimly, flipping through a gallery of images they had collected over the week. New faces every few days, like inventory. Samara's fists clenched on her lap. Her voice was low and hoarse. "What are they doing to them?" Louis hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I think they use the children as social capital. Some are displayed as adopted children during private parties. Others as rescued mascots for investors or photo ops. It's fashionable, in certain circles, to be seen with a black child. The more unusual, the better. "Unusual," Samara repeated, the word bitter on her tongue. "You mean stolen?" Yes. Lewis's voice darkened. And I believe some are taken further, sold off to private buyers in other countries. It's human trafficking, but with the facade of philanthropy. All very tasteful, all very whitewashed. They gathered everything, hours of video, dozens of photographs, annotated maps of the island, surveillance notes. Lewis began contacting international child protection organizations and legal advocates he had worked with before. A few responded cautiously. Some refused. The island's owners were powerful. There had been lawsuits in the past, all dismissed for lack of evidence or settled in silence. "They've buried this before," Louis muttered, tapping his phone in frustration. "But with what we have, they can't ignore it." Samara sat beside him, staring at the map. Her finger traced the shoreline of the island, stopping at a secluded inlet where she had seen the girls playing 2 days ago. Her voice was steady. "I'm going in." Louis turned to her, startled. "Sam." "I'm going in," she repeated. "You said you have a contact who used to work as staff." He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "A woman named Clemence. She worked in one of the kitchen crews. I helped her when she fled the island after a disagreement with a client." "Can she get me credentials, a way in?" "I'll ask," he said, "but even if she can, it's dangerous. You'd have to go in under a fake name. If they suspect anything—" "They won't," Samara said. "They'll see what they want to see. A quiet black woman with a service role. Invisible." The conversation ended there, but her resolve remained. 3 days later, Clemence delivered a forged ID and a fabricated resume. Samara became Gloria Michel, a French Caribbean cook with experience on private yachts and resorts. Louis coached her for hours, drilling her on kitchen terminology, expected behavior, emergency signals. Clemence walked her through the uniforms, the mannerisms, the hierarchy on the island. No eye contact, no questions. No voice unless spoken to. She would be a shadow, a pair of hands behind a cutting board. The morning she boarded the yacht that ferried staff to the island, Samara wore her borrowed uniform and kept her head down. No one paid her any attention. The other workers smoked in silence, scrolling through phones or staring at the sea. The air was heavy with salt and quiet dread. When the island came into view, Samara felt her breath hitch. It looked like paradise. Palm trees swaying, white villas nestled among the cliffs, the sea a shimmering blue. But beneath that beauty, she felt something hollow, something wrong. The yacht docked at a private jetty where a woman in a tailored suit with a clipboard began calling out names. Samara waited for hers, and when it came, she stepped forward and nodded. No questions were asked. She was led through a side path, past manicured gardens and marble fountains, into a gleaming kitchen where other staff bustled about. She was assigned to prep vegetables and clean counters. No one spoke to her beyond curt instructions. Cameras watched from the corners. The air smelled of citrus and something chemical. That evening, she carried a tray of fruit past the glass doors of a dining hall. Inside, white families lounged on velvet chairs, sipping wine, and beside them, perched like accessories, were children. Black children, Asian children, all silent, all perfectly dressed. Their smiles didn't reach their eyes. And then she saw them. Amara and Anissa sat on a bench beside a pale woman in pearls. The girls wore matching white dresses, their hair styled into buns. Amara stared blankly ahead. Anissa fidgeted with her hands. Samara's breath caught in her throat. Her knees nearly gave way. She forced herself to move, to keep walking, to disappear into the kitchen before anyone noticed her trembling. That night, in the storage room behind the pantry, she cried into her apron, silently, shaken with fury and heartbreak. Over the next few days, she watched them whenever she could. The girls had been given new names, Belle and Sarah. She heard the staff refer to them as the twins from Louisiana, as if they were pedigree pets. They followed instructions, smiled on cue, said thank you in French. But when they were alone, their faces crumpled. They didn't laugh. They didn't run. Samara began gathering evidence from inside. She found boxes of sedatives in the medical room, files listing arrival dates and forged adoption records. She stole copies, hid them in the soles of her shoes. She slipped notes into Louis's drop spot near the compost bins, which he retrieved at night disguised as a janitor. Slowly, piece by piece, they built the final case. One evening, she found a moment alone with the girls. They were in the garden, supervised from a distance. She passed them on the path, dropping a small shell she had found the first day of the search, an identical one they used to collect on the beaches of New Orleans. Amara saw it first. She picked it up, studied it, and something flickered in her eyes. She didn't speak. She didn't react. But when Samara walked away, she heard the softest sound behind her, Anissa whispering, "It smells like home." Samara returned to her quarters that night with a plan forming. They were close. So close. The island's schedule, the identities of the guests, the security rotations, Louis had everything he needed. It was time. Tomorrow, the final delivery of the summer would arrive. A yacht filled with new children for a weekend gala. High-profile guests, photographers, the perfect opportunity for exposure. Samara stood at the window of her dormitory and looked out across the water, where the mainland glimmered faintly in the distance. Her daughters were only a few hundred meters away, but that distance held the weight of an entire world. She pressed a hand to the glass, her voice low. "I'm coming for you." The morning sun rose slowly over Saint-Marin-d'Olaire, gilding the white rooftops of the villas and casting long shadows across the marble walkways. The sea surrounding the island sparkled like polished glass, hiding the dark truths beneath its calm surface. From her small window in the staff quarters, Samara watched the yachts approach, their white hulls slicing the water as they made their way toward the private dock. Today was the day everything would begin. Or end. Inside the kitchen, there was a different energy. The staff moved briskly, the chefs barking orders with a clipped urgency, the servers polishing silverware to perfection. There was no room for mistakes. The guest list for the weekend gala included some of the most powerful names in Europe, billionaires, politicians, and celebrities who paid not only for privacy, but for a curated experience no one else could access. Among the amenities promised to them were designer meals, priceless wines, and, unspoken but understood, the presentation of exclusive companions for social display. These were the children, some quiet and docile, others confused and frightened, carefully selected for their beauty, obedience, and exotic appeal. Samara moved through the kitchen like a shadow, invisible to the white-gloved supervisors and barking sous chefs. She peeled vegetables, washed cutting boards, and loaded trays. No one noticed the way her eyes scanned every clipboard, every schedule left unattended. No one saw her slip a folded sheet of paper beneath the floor mat by the service door, a drop point Louis had instructed her to use if things became urgent. She was a ghost among ghosts. Later that morning, she was called to help deliver refreshments to the outdoor lounge near the southern veranda. It was a sprawling, sun-drenched terrace overlooking the water, where the wealthiest guests sat, beneath wide umbrellas sipping imported tea and eating macaroons. A string quartet played soft music near a trellis of white flowers, and everything smelled of lemon oil and sea salt. Samara pushed a cart of iced fruit juices toward the edge of the veranda and froze. The girls were there. Amara and Anissa sat on a cushioned bench beside a woman with platinum blonde hair and diamond earrings that sparkled like stars. The woman chatted with another guest while gently stroking Anissa's hair as if she were a doll. Amara sat unnaturally still, hands folded in her lap, eyes focused on the horizon. Anissa, fidgeting, glanced up as Samara approached and their eyes met. For a moment, neither moved. Samara's heart stopped. Anissa blinked once, twice, and then dropped her gaze. Samara looked away, her hands steady as she poured juice into a crystal glass. The girls had learned to mask their fear. They had learned what was expected of them. She could barely breathe as she retreated into the kitchen. There, behind the safety of the swinging door, she leaned against the wall, her hands shaking. She had thought the worst pain was not knowing where they were. She had been wrong. The worst pain was seeing them there, alive but altered, erased. Her daughters had become ornaments. That night, she found the shell she had left for them placed carefully outside the staff quarters. It was a message. They remembered. They knew she was close. The following morning, Samara was assigned to help with the final preparations for the gala dinner. The guest list was posted beside the refrigerator, and she took a mental snapshot of every name. One of the sous chefs complained loudly about the arrival of new stock, referring to the latest group of children brought in by a private jet that had landed on the far side of the island at dawn. There were 8 of them, between the ages of 4 and 9, each selected for different clients. She saw the folders, headshots, fabricated biographies, schedules, all of it cataloged with the cold precision of a logistics company. Her stomach churned. She had to act soon. That afternoon, she returned to the girls' quarters during laundry duty. The building, located near the edge of the service path, had minimal security. After all, where would the children go? Most didn't even know where they were. Samara moved quickly, sorting folded linens until she found their room. The door was cracked open. Inside, Amara sat cross-legged on the bed, staring at a coloring book. Anissa was at the window, looking out at the sea. They turned at the sound of her footsteps. Samara closed the door behind her and dropped to her knees. Her voice cracked. "It's me," she whispered. "It's Mama." At first, they didn't speak. The silence was heavier than any scream. Amara's eyes filled with tears, but her body remained frozen. Anissa took a step forward, then stopped. "They said you died," she whispered. "They said you gave us away." "I didn't," Samara said, her heart breaking. "I never stopped looking. I came all this way. I'm here now. I promise. I'm going to get you out." Anissa burst into sobs and ran into her arms. Samara held her tightly, her hand reaching for Amara, who slowly crawled across the bed and wrapped herself around them both. She could feel their thin ribs beneath the fabric of their dresses, feel the way they trembled with disbelief. "We have to be quiet," Samara said. "Just a little longer, but we're almost free." That night, she signaled Louis with a code they had agreed upon. 3 short blinks of light from a hidden flashlight near the north watchtower. He responded with one long blink. The operation was underway. The next morning brought a strange, almost reverent silence to the island. The gala was set to begin that evening. Samara watched the crew prepare for the biggest event of the summer, the false joy of celebration thick in the air. Staff polished silver trays until they could see their own reflections. Perfumed candles were placed along walkways. The children were dressed and styled like porcelain dolls, taught how to walk, how to stand, how to smile without showing teeth. Samara saw her daughters among them. They moved like sleepwalkers. That afternoon, a new staff member arrived. Tall, clean-shaven, wearing the uniform of an external contractor. Samara recognized him immediately. It was Louis, disguised as a sanitation worker. He gave no signal, no nod, just passed her near the kitchen garden and dropped a folded note into her apron pocket. Later, she read it behind the supply closet. Final delivery complete. Police in place. Operation confirmed. Do not engage. Protect girls. We move tonight. It was real. It was happening. As dusk settled over the island, the guests arrived at the main villa. They stepped from yachts and helicopters in glittering gowns and tailored suits, laughing and sipping champagne. A live jazz band played beneath a silk canopy strung with fairy lights. Servers moved like clockwork through the crowd, and among the guests were the children, assigned to tables, seated beside patrons, occasionally called upon for photographs. Samara saw her daughters standing near a balcony beside the same blonde woman from before. She drifted closer, pretending to carry refreshments, staying within line of sight. Anissa spotted her first. This time, the girl didn't look away. She held her gaze. The moment had come. Louis, from the shadow of a service tent, tapped his headset once. At the same time, a faint rumble stirred in the distance, a low thrum growing louder, closer. Helicopters. More than one. The lights flickered. Confusion spread like a virus. Guests turned toward the sound. Uniformed figures emerged from the trees, from the paths, from behind the flowered hedges. Shouts rang out. Flashlights beamed across the lawn. The music stopped. "Police!" someone shouted. Chaos erupted. Samara dropped her tray and ran. She reached her daughters just as one of the handlers grabbed their wrists. With strength born of fury and desperation, she lunged forward and struck the man with both fists, pulling the girls to her chest. He staggered, then bolted as two officers chased him. Samara held her daughters tight. "I've got you," she whispered. "I've got you." All around them, the illusion shattered. Guests screamed. Some tried to run, only to be blocked by barricades. Officers arrested administrators, medical staff, and handlers. Dozens of children were led away by social workers and paramedics. In the confusion, Samara was guided to a private vehicle waiting near the staff dormitories. Louis appeared beside her, flushed and breathless. "We did it," he said. "We have everything." The girls clung to her, dazed and silent. A nurse examined them in the back of the van, shining a light in their eyes, checking their pulse. "They've been sedated," she said, "but they're stable. We'll get them to a clinic." As the van pulled away from the island, Samara looked back through the window. Saint-Marin d'Olaire stood silent and bright beneath the moonlight, beautiful and still, as if nothing had happened at all. But now the world knew, and her daughters were with her. She would never let them go again. The clinic in Bordeaux smelled of antiseptic and lavender oil, an odd combination that clung to Samara's clothes and hair as she paced the sterile corridor outside the pediatric recovery room. Her daughters were inside, asleep in matching white hospital beds, their breathing slow and even, their faces pale but peaceful. A nurse had dimmed the lights, placed a soft blanket over each of them, and assured Samara for the third time that the sedatives were wearing off safely, that they would wake in a few more hours, that they were physically unharmed. But no one could promise what had been done to their minds. No one could calculate the toll of months of manipulation, silence, and fear. Samara stood motionless, her back to the wall, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of their chests through the window. She had held them both in her arms as the emergency transport pulled away from the island, whispering promises into their ears, pressing her cheek to their tangled hair, trying to convince herself this was real, that they were really there, that they were safe. The girls hadn't spoken. They hadn't resisted her touch, but they had barely responded to anything at all. Their bodies had felt limp, their eyes cloudy, their small hands folded like paper. Louis arrived at the clinic shortly after midnight, still wearing his borrowed sanitation uniform beneath a raincoat. He carried a battered briefcase filled with hard drives, photo evidence, and notarized affidavits from the raid on the island. His face was drawn, but his eyes burned with the energy of vindication. "They're gathering the final statements now," he said, his voice low. "Interpol wants full copies of everything. The children are being processed under protective status, and the French Ministry of Justice has opened a preliminary inquiry into crimes against minors, human trafficking, abuse of international adoption laws, and corruption." Samara didn't turn to look at him. She couldn't tear her eyes from the window. "What about the clients?" she asked. "The ones at the gala?" "Some were detained," he said. "Others managed to vanish before the barriers were fully sealed. But they're being identified. Most of them were photographed. A few were already known to law enforcement in other countries. The net is widening." Samara folded her arms tightly across her chest. Her voice was sharp. "They're going to bury this." "Not this time," Louis said. "Too many witnesses, too much proof. The scale is too big to hide." She said nothing for a while. Then, quietly, she asked, "Did they really believe they'd get away with it?" Louis exhaled slowly. "They always do. That's how this kind of system works. It doesn't just happen in the dark. It survives in the light because no one wants to look too closely." Later that night, an agent from Interpol's Child Exploitation Division arrived to take her formal statement. The woman was professional but kind, and she took meticulous notes as Samara recounted everything: how the girls had disappeared, the forged documents, the evasive authorities, the anonymous tip, the search through La Rochelle, and finally the infiltration of the island. She told the story in precise detail, never once raising her voice, never once breaking down. She had cried enough already. Now she needed the world to listen. Every word mattered. The agent promised that her testimony would be sealed under international protection, that her daughters would be assigned a security detail, that their identities would be restored, their names cleared, their citizenship reinstated. But Samara only nodded politely. What she wanted wasn't paperwork. She wanted a reckoning. When the girls finally woke, it was Anissa who spoke first. She blinked in the soft light of the hospital room, her eyes scanning the ceiling before landing on Samara, who had fallen asleep sitting upright beside the bed. Anissa reached out a hand and touched her mother's arm. Samara stirred instantly, eyes flying open, her breath caught in her throat. "Are we still on the island?" Anissa asked, her voice small. Samara shook her head and leaned in. "No, baby, you're safe now." "Where's Amara?" "In the bed next to you," Samara said, pulling the curtain back gently so Anissa could see her sister. "She's just resting." Anissa nodded slowly. "They said you left us." "I didn't," Samara whispered. "I never did. I came for you. I looked everywhere. And now I'm here." The little girl's lips trembled. "They said you were dead." "I'm not," Samara said. "I'm alive. I'm right here." Anissa burst into quiet sobs and reached out. Samara gathered her into her arms, holding her as if the world might break apart again at any second. Amara stirred then, her eyes fluttering open, her gaze foggy until it settled on Samara's face. She didn't speak, but her fingers reached out, clutching her mother's shirt. Samara held them both, rocking them gently, whispering over and over, "It's over. You're home. You're home." For days, the girls remained under observation. Doctors assessed them, therapists began cautious evaluations, and Samara never left their side. They had nightmares, they woke up screaming, they flinched at loud sounds and unfamiliar voices. But slowly, fragments of themselves began to return. Anissa started drawing again, shaky stick figures with big eyes and long arms that always reached out for something unseen. Amara sat for hours beside the window, watching birds pass through the trees, not speaking, but no longer staring through people like glass. Outside the hospital, the story exploded. The news media caught wind of the operation, first in France, then across Europe and into the United States. Headlines blazed with words like child trafficking ring, elite exploitation, and exclusive island resort. Footage from the raid leaked to journalists. Arrests, confiscated records, images of terrified children being carried out in blankets. Louis's articles were picked up by international outlets. His name returned to the bylines he had once been banned from. He gave interviews, released documents, testified in closed-door hearings, and through it all, he repeated one sentence again and again. This woman found what governments missed. This mother crossed oceans when no one would help her. There were arrests, not just on the island, but in Paris, Geneva, Madrid, and Los Angeles. Lawyers scrambled, politicians deflected, and nonprofit organizations issued statements condemning the abuse. But the names leaked anyway. Samara recognized some from the news. Actors, CEOs, a former ambassador. It became a firestorm. And in the middle of it was her face, her voice, her story. She spoke before a UN panel on child protection, invited as a witness. She stood before rows of officials and representatives, dressed in a simple suit, her voice firm and steady. "You want to know how this happened?" she said. "It happened because no one listened. It happened because these children were black and poor, and their mothers were tired, and the systems that were supposed to protect them protected the predators instead. And I'm not the only one. There are more, so many more. But no one looked. No one believed us, until I went myself." There was a pause after her speech. No applause, just silence. And then one delegate stood, then another, and another. Back in Bordeaux, Samara watched her daughters rediscover childhood. They ran again. They laughed, cautiously at first, then freely. Anissa danced to music she found online, while Amara began keeping a journal. They played with paint, wrote stories about magic horses and brave queens. They argued over what cartoons to watch and made forts out of pillows. Every night, Samara tucked them into bed and whispered that she loved them, and every night they whispered it back. One afternoon, Anissa came to her holding a crumpled drawing. "This is you," she said, "fighting the monsters." Samara looked at the picture, a stick figure mom with fire in her hands, standing between two small girls and a huge, fanged shadow. She smiled and kissed her daughter's forehead. That's exactly right. The fight wasn't over. The trials would take years. The full scope of the trafficking ring was still being unraveled. More victims were being identified. But Samara had done what no one else could. She had broken the silence. She had pulled the curtain back. And in doing so, she had brought her daughters back into the light. The transition from clinic to civilian life was neither swift nor simple. Though the media storm had begun to settle and the legal machinery of justice ground on with sluggish weight, within the quiet walls of their temporary apartment in Bordeaux, time moved differently for Samara and her daughters. Here, Helan did not unfold in grand pronouncements or televised declarations. It crept, tentative and inconsistent, through the ordinary details of their day. A breakfast where the girls asked for jam instead of toast, a moment where Anisa giggled at a cartoon without flinching at the sound of a raised voice, an evening when Amara read aloud from a picture book, haltingly but with effort, her voice trembling yet present. Samara had insisted on taking them home as soon as doctors deemed it safe. But home was no longer New Orleans. Too many memories, too many ghosts. She couldn't bear the thought of returning to the same cracked walls and street corners that had watched her spiral into despair. She wanted new soil, new light. Bordeaux, where the girls had first woken in safety, seemed as fitting a place as any to begin again. The state offered support. A small flat in the northern district was arranged, modest but clean, with a sunlit kitchen and 2 bedrooms. A local aid group provided furniture, toys, art supplies, and a refrigerator stocked with groceries. Every piece of furniture they placed felt like a promise. The girls' new beds, twin bookcases filled with donated storybooks, the plush armchair Samara claimed in the corner of the living room where she could sit and watch them breathe, just to remind herself that they were real. The girls were enrolled in therapy through a private trauma center specializing in child recovery. The sessions were gentle, observational at first. The therapists asked no questions, only created safe spaces where the girls could draw or play. It took weeks before Anisa would speak freely during the sessions, and even longer before Amara would enter the room without her mother beside her. Samara attended a different kind of therapy, grief counseling interlaced with survivor support, where she spoke in slow, measured syllables, sorting through the mess of what she'd endured. Some nights, the girls woke screaming. Samara would rush into their room to find Anisa curled under the blankets, sobbing incoherently, or Amara frozen in place, wide-eyed, as though waiting for a command that never came. Samara would hold them both, whispering lullabies in a voice so raw it cracked. In the dark, her hands never stopped moving, stroking their hair, rubbing their backs, reminding them they were safe. She knew the monsters they had faced didn't vanish in the daylight. They lingered in memory, in shadow, in silence. Outside, the world continued to reckon with what had been uncovered. The arrests connected to the island expanded into a far-reaching investigation that implicated dozens of individuals across multiple countries. Several members of the Saint-Marin-d'Olaire Club were exposed as having ties to fake adoption agencies and non-governmental organizations that had acted as laundering fronts for stolen children. Lawsuits erupted, non-profits restructured, entire legal teams were removed. The French president made a public address denouncing the profound moral failure of institutions that had allowed such a network to thrive in secrecy. But Samara watched all of it from a distance. She knew better than to believe that declarations equaled change. Lewis continued his work, now elevated to the ranks of international whistleblowers and watchdog journalists. He published a book detailing the investigation, including transcripts of Samara's testimony, interviews with the former staff members, and deeply researched exposés on the legislative blind spots that had allowed child trafficking to masquerade as charity. The book made headlines, landed on bestseller lists, and was shortlisted for literary awards. He offered Samara a portion of the royalties. She refused the money, but accepted the dedication. For the mother who looked into the abyss and refused to let it swallow her children. In the midst of all this, Samara applied for permanent residency in France. The government fast-tracked the process, granting her and the girls legal protection and a path to citizenship. The day they received the approval letter, Amara read it aloud in slow, careful French, her accent lilting and shy. Anissa clapped and hugged her sister, and Samara laughed. An honest, full sound she hadn't made in over a year. But healing was not linear. There were setbacks, triggers, days when Amara withdrew into herself and stared out the window for hours. Days when Anissa became frantic if Samara was even a minute late returning from the store. Once, while shopping, Anissa spotted a man who resembled one of the handlers from the island. She froze, then bolted down the aisle, sobbing hysterically. Samara had to abandon the cart and cradle her daughter on the floor until her breathing calmed. That night, both girls slept in Samara's bed. She didn't close her eyes once. The hardest conversations came slowly, in fragments. One morning, over breakfast, Amara looked up from her cereal and asked, "Mama, why did they take us?" Samara set down her spoon. She'd practiced the answer in therapy, but the real moment turned her mouth dry. Because there are people in the world who think they can take whatever they want, even children, even love. Anissa frowned. "But they said you gave us away." "I didn't," Samara said gently. "They lied. I would never give you away. I came for you the moment I knew." Amara stirred her cereal quietly. "They said you died. I didn't. I survived, and I never stopped looking, not for a second." They nodded, slowly. That day, the girls clung to her a little tighter. From then on, they began to speak more openly about the food on the island, the games they were told to play, the false names, the cold medicine that made them sleepy. They described the photo room, the adults who gave them instructions, the other children who came and went. Their voices remained calm, as if recounting a strange, long nightmare. But Samara heard the tremors underneath and wept for each sentence they spoke. Eventually, the girls returned to school. A small private academy with trauma-informed staff accepted them with open arms. At first, Samara walked them to the door every morning and waited until they were inside before leaving. They made no friends for the first month. But time, patient and stubborn, chipped away at the fear. Anissa joined the music club. Amara, to Samara's astonishment, signed up for chess. Their first report cards came with glowing remarks, and Samara pinned them to the fridge like badges of honor. In the spring, Samara was asked to speak at a conference for child advocacy in Geneva. She hesitated, not wanting to reopen wounds, but the girls encouraged her. "Tell them," Amara said, "so they know." Samara stood before a packed auditorium, her hair pinned up, her voice steady. "You ask what it means to protect children," she said. "But protection without action is a lullaby. We live in a world where children can be bought, branded, and sold, and the systems meant to shield them are often too slow, too cautious, or too compromised to act. I did what I did because I had to, because no one else would, and because I am a mother." The room was silent when she finished. Then applause. Then standing applause. She returned home that night to a drawing Anissa had left on her pillow, a picture of Samara in a cape flying through the sky. Above her, two girls with stars in their hands. That night, Samara lay between her daughters, holding them as they drifted to sleep. The city, outside their window, hummed softly, life unfolding as it always had. But inside this small apartment, a new world had been built. One forged in fire and grief, but now held together by love stronger than any silence. Samara closed her eyes and let sleep take her, for once unburdened by fear. They were safe, and they were free. The morning of the ceremony dawned cool and gray, with a thin mist curling along the coastline of La Rochelle like a memory returning to the surface. It had been just over 2 years since Samara had stood trembling on that very same harbor, holding a flyer with the faces of her missing daughters and asking strangers for help that never came. The sea looked unchanged, but everything else had shifted. The air no longer tasted of desperation. The quiet now carried something else. Weight, certainly, but also a strange sense of reverence. A modest crowd had begun to gather by the edge of the old marina. Local officials stood beside representatives from the Ministry of Justice, UNICEF, and several child advocacy organizations. A dozen news cameras were already positioned discreetly behind the railing, though they had been instructed to remain passive. This was not a press event. It was a memorial. Not for death, but for return. The plaque itself stood under a temporary cloth near a low stone wall just above the tide line. Around it, flower arrangements formed a quiet circle. White lilies, wild sunflowers, and 2 small bunches of violets, chosen by the girls. Samara stood beside them, a hand on each of their shoulders. They were taller now. Their hair had grown long again. Amara had chosen a pale blue dress with small white buttons, and Anissa wore her favorite yellow sweater, even though the morning was already warming. Neither clung to Samara anymore, but neither stood far. The invisible thread between them, spun through anguish and restoration, was unbroken. The mayor gave a brief introduction, acknowledging the crowd, the officials, and the journalists watching from a respectful distance. His voice was formal but warm, and when he spoke Samara's name, he paused. His French was clipped with emotion as he recounted how a single mother had exposed what nations had ignored, and how her refusal to accept silence had become a beacon for countless others. Louis stood off to the side, his arms crossed loosely, his face unreadable. He had flown in the day before from Paris, where he was consulting on a new legal initiative meant to prevent any organization from hiding children behind corporate fronts. He had been offered a government role, but declined. His work, he said, belonged in the field. He hadn't spoken much since his arrival, but he didn't need to. His presence was its own affirmation, a quiet tether to everything they had survived together. When it came time for the unveiling, Samara stepped forward alone. She had been asked if she wanted a podium, a microphone, a translator. She refused them all. This moment wasn't for officials or reporters. It was for her, for the children, for every terrified parent who had once stood where she had, grasping for hope in the dark. She took the cloth in both hands and pulled it away with slow, deliberate care. The metal beneath was cool and brushed steel, the letters engraved with precision. There were no logos, no governmental crests, no names of sponsors. Just the words she had chosen herself. Here, a mother refused to give up. And, because she did not, her daughters were found. May all lost voices be heard. May no silence be final. Below it, etched in smaller font, were the names Amara and Anissa, reunited. Samara stepped back. She did not cry. She had no tears left for mourning. What she felt now was something steadier, something like justice. The girls stepped forward beside her. Anissa took her hand. Amara looked up at her with a faint smile, then turned to the crowd. It was Amara who spoke first. The microphone caught her voice, clear, quiet, but unwavering. We were told our mother forgot us, but she didn't. She looked for us even when nobody believed her. We're standing here because she remembered who we were, even when we forgot." Anissa squeezed her sister's hand. "They tried to change our names, but Mama gave them back to us. They tried to tell us we didn't belong to anyone, but she proved them wrong." The applause was gentle but honest. It rose slowly, like sunlight over the sea. Afterward, there were photos, though Samara insisted they be few. She agreed to one shot, her standing with the girls in front of the plaque, hands joined, faces calm. The image would later appear on the cover of a report distributed across Europe titled Unseen Chains, the hidden system of child commodification. It would be cited in policy changes, school training manuals, and international forums. But for now, it was simply a photograph, a memory held in light. They spent the afternoon in the harbor town, walking through the narrow streets where Samara had once wandered alone. The cafe where she had washed dishes was still there. She paused across the street from it, watching as a young woman carried a tray of empty glasses out to the sidewalk. The sound of laughter drifted through the open windows. The place looked smaller than she remembered. Louis joined them for lunch in a quiet courtyard cafe just off the main square. The girls talked easily now, no longer timid around him. He teased Anissa about her third helping of fries, and Amara asked about his next article. He didn't speak of work. Instead, he asked about school, their friends, the new dog Samara had adopted, a gangly rescue mutt named Momo, who slept beside the girls each night like a silent sentinel. As the day wore on, the clouds cleared. The light over the harbor turned soft and golden. Before they boarded the evening train back to Bordeaux, Samara walked one last time to the edge of the pier and looked out across the water. She didn't see the island from here. It lay far beyond the horizon, behind layers of land and history and distance. But she felt its presence still, not as a place of terror, but as a reminder. The things that had happened there were real. They always would be. But they no longer defined her daughters. They no longer had the power to devour her story. That night, as the train rocked gently southward and the girls dozed against her shoulders, Samara stared out at the fields and trees rushing past the window. Her phone buzzed once, an email from an organization in South Africa requesting her to speak. She bookmarked it but didn't reply. She wasn't ready to plan that far ahead. Not yet. When they arrived home, the apartment was filled with the scent of basil from the plant Anissa had insisted on growing in a painted ceramic pot. Momo barked once in greeting and then trotted back to his blanket by the heater. Amara set her bag down and wandered into her room, pulling out a notebook. Anissa changed into her pajamas and curled beside Samara on the couch, thumb in her mouth, her eyes fluttering. "Did we do something good today?" she asked sleepily. Samara kissed the top of her head. "We did something true." The apartment settled into quiet. Outside, the city lights twinkled like stars. Inside, the past finally felt like something that could be put down. Not forgotten, not erased, but set aside with care. Like a letter folded and kept in a drawer, just in case someone else might one day need to read it. And, on the shore of La Rochelle, beneath the stone wall and the carved metal plaque, the sea whispered its eternal rhythms. The tide moved in, the tide moved out, but the name of the mother who did not stop remained, not carved in stone, carved in the world. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch our next videos to uncover more powerful stories and share this one with someone who needs to hear it.